Hello and welcome to the English Grammar Workshop. My name is Shad, and in this video, we're going to be talking about grammar, particularly English grammar. Now, in Nigeria, grammar happens to be a word we throw around a lot. You make a mistake in speech or in writing, and someone says, your grammar is incorrect or your grammar is bad. But have you ever stopped to wonder what is grammar really and why does it matter? These, among other questions, are what we will be discussing in today's video. Now, before we go any further, feel free to pause the video and just, reflect on what you think grammar is. To help you understand what grammar is, we will be looking at some of the things it isn't. And trust me, there are tons of misconceptions about what grammar is all about. But since we can't cover all of them in this video, we'll be looking at seven popular definitions of grammar, several of which are misconceptions, and we'll be busting those misconceptions in a bit. The first and perhaps even the most popular misconception people have about grammar is that it's a collection of what we call grandiloquent words. Now, grandiloquent words are more commonly referred to as big words in Nigeria. There are those words that are excessive, complex words you typically use when you want to confuse someone or impress them to sound like you have a very rich vocabulary. But the issue with this idea of grammar is that it reduces grammar to vocabulary, and not just any kind of vocabulary, but specifically complex vocabulary. But here's the thing with this definition: grammar isn't complex vocabulary. And believe it or not, you can actually make perfect grammatical sentences in English using only simple words. Take, for instance, this sentence: I like riddles. Now, someone who wanted to impress using grandiloquent words would say something like, conundrums tickle my fancy. But both of these sentences are grammatical. And if we can express the same idea using simple words and still retain their grammaticality, then that already punches a hole in the assumption that grammar is a collection of grandiloquent words. Now, this other popular definition of grammar isn't so different from the last. This one is that grammar is a collection of every word in a language. But the implication of this particular definition is that you can have every word in a language arranged anyhow and it would make a grammatical sentence. Now, feel free to pause the video and reflect on this definition. Would you agree with it or would you disagree with it, and why? Now, the first problem with this definition is that it more accurately describes a dictionary or a vocabulary, because it's in a dictionary that you would expect to find every or nearly every word in a particular language, not in grammar. Also, the grammaticality of a sentence doesn't depend on whether you used actual words or not. If you use actual words in a language, but then you order it in a way that is wrong, it will give you an ungrammatical expression. So let's get practical a bit. Now, consider the word her. Is it a correct word? Yes. And then the word likely. In English, that is an actual word. And then the determiner, the, that's the definite article, the, also a word. And then dog, definitely a word. Now, if grammar were a collection of every word in a language, What that means is that we could arrange these four correct words as in dog the likely her, and it would make a grammatical sentence. But as we know, this sentence isn't grammatical for reasons that will be explained later in the video. So, this definition of grammar, where it gets it wrong is that, like the first one, it confuses grammar with vocabulary, and unfortunately, they aren't interchangeable. Now, another equally interesting definition of grammar is that it is simply a native speaker's intuitive knowledge of their language. But now, here's why this definition is particularly problematic. The fact that a person is a native speaker of any language doesn't automatically eliminate the possibility of them making mistakes when speaking or writing in that language. And believe me, native speakers of English do make lots of mistakes when producing the language. Besides, we can't base something as fundamental as grammar on something as subjective as native speaker status. Because if we were to do that, then what that would mean is that grammatical conventions would be entirely subjective. And when that happens, anything could be right or wrong, grammatical or ungrammatical, depending on the native speaker you're talking to or writing to. Because one native speaker could say, this sentence is grammatical, while another could disagree and say, no, that's ungrammatical. And they would both be right because they both have their native speaker badge, pressed on their chest. So we can't have grammar being so very fundamental based on something as subjective as a native speaker's intuitive knowledge of their language. The fourth definition on this list, which is no less interesting than the other three definitions of grammar we've looked at so far, is that grammar is all about speaking like a Briton or an American. Now, why this definition is particularly interesting is that it seems to confuse grammar with accent or dialect. And what it implies is that those other people, perhaps in other countries, who speak English but just don't speak it with either of the various British or American accents, are unable to produce grammatical sentences. Such a view of grammar and grammar usage is elitist and condescending at best. Because, on the one hand, you could speak English with a Nigerian accent or an Indian accent and still make perfectly grammatical sentences. And on the other hand, you could speak English with a British accent and still make ungrammatical sentences. Another problem with this definition of grammar is that it neglects the writing aspect of grammar and restricts grammar usage to just speech, since it assumes that grammar is only about speaking like a Briton or an American. If you think grammar is a list of writing rules, or if you once thought that, you aren't alone. In fact, I used to hold this view about grammar, and I believe one of the reasons why most people think that grammar is simply about writing rules is that at times, other than style, what makes the difference between mediocre writing and really good writing is grammar. But just like the definition of grammar that assumes the grammar is all about speaking like a Briton or an American, this one also restricts grammar to a particular aspect. Only in this case, it's not speech, it's writing. And even if we wanted to restrict grammar to one of those two aspects, it would be wrong to restrict it to writing on the basis that writing was invented merely 5,000 years ago. And before then, we had several languages with well defined grammatical systems. Alright, so let's take a look at this other definition of grammar. Grammar is a fixed, unchanging set of rules contained in English grammar textbooks and taught by qualified teachers. Now, this takes us back to our primary or maybe secondary school days when we saw our teachers as custodians of English grammar, and grammar was simply whatever they said it was, or rather, whatever the textbooks said it was. So we started to view grammar textbooks as some sort of English grammar Bible, and our teachers were the priests or pastors, and we trusted the credibility of their interpretation of English grammar without really giving it much scrutiny as to whether or not it was right or wrong. Now, the problem with assuming the grammar is this fixed, unchanging set of rules is that it implies that language itself is fixed and unchanging. And we all know that languages evolve. Every language evolves. If you were to compare Middle English to Old English and the English we use today, you'd see some very distinguishable differences among all these versions of English. All you have to do is to pick up a book written by any author in either one of these eras, and you might be surprised by how much English has evolved over the years. Now, since these differences obviously exist among different versions of English, but grammar is supposedly fixed, then what that means is that it is either we've moved away from proper grammar, that is, the English of old is grammatical, and then since English now has changed, present day English isn't grammatical, or vice versa. Perhaps Middle English, Old English, and all other earlier versions of English language weren't grammatical, but then present day English is grammatical. But the truth is, it's not always that simple. It's not that black or white, because grammar is such an integral aspect of language, and just as language evolves, sometimes grammar evolves along with it. So, even though Old English grammar is clearly different from present day English grammar, they are both to be considered grammatical in the era in which that language or that version of grammar was used. So, if you saw a sentence constructed in the era in which Old English was spoken and it conforms to Old English grammar, that sentence is to be considered grammatical for its era. And even if the grammar guiding that construction no longer is relevant today, we do not say the sentence is ungrammatical because we have to consider the fact that it was grammatical then, but English has evolved past that point at which it was grammatical. If I were to criticize this definition of grammar any further, my criticism would be that just like the native speaker's intuition example, this one also makes grammar seem subjective based on what English grammar teachers say it is or isn't, as the case may be. Now let's take a look at the last definition of grammar on our list. Grammar is a system of rules guiding how words are formed, combined, and arranged to form higher grammatical units like phrases, clauses, and sentences. Now, feel free to pause this video and consider what you think about this definition. Do you agree with it? Do you disagree with it? And for an even greater challenge, whether you agree with it or disagree with it, consider figuring out why you do. Now, before we go any further, I'd like you to bear in mind that when it comes to English grammar, definitions are hardly ever absolute, even those definitions considered correct at times. Now, what does this mean? There are times when you might see a definition that's really good, but then a scholar or a linguist might point out holes in it, that is, areas it doesn't seem to account for. So don't be surprised if some scholar or linguist tries to point out a hole in this particular definition that we're looking at, but that does not discredit its accuracy. In fact, compared to the other six definitions we've looked at and several other definitions out there, this definition might even be considered to be one of the most accurate definitions of grammar, and you'll see why in a minute. So, what makes this definition better than the other six? Basically, what does it have that the other definitions don't? And what do they have that it doesn't? Now, let's take another look at that definition. Grammar is a system of rules guiding how words are formed, combined, and arranged to form higher grammatical units like phrases, clauses, and sentences. I've taken the liberty to highlight key points in this definition. It's by breaking it down step by step, taking the definition one keyword at a time, that we will come to see why this definition excels in areas where the other six simply don't. Now, the first part of this definition is that grammar is a system of rules, not a checklist of rules, not a list of rules. It's a system. Now, what does this mean exactly? Far too often, people treat grammar as though it were a handbook containing a long list of do's and don'ts. Don't do this instead, don't do that instead, and so on. Maybe grammar wouldn't be so complicated if that were the case. Maybe things would be very simple at the cost of creativity. But grammar is way, way more than just a checklist of do's and don'ts. It's a living system, it's a mental framework that every language speaker unconsciously knows, and it may be expressed through rules or an interrelationship of rules at times, which is why you see certain rules that might have exceptions, and the rules are often not so rigid that they don't allow for creativity. It's also because grammar is a system rather than a list of rules that we have the ability to produce an infinite number of grammatical expressions, and why many of these grammatical frameworks are subject to change and evolution as language itself evolves or gets adapted to certain societal expectations or conventions. Now, this isn't to say that there aren't people who still treat grammar like a checklist of do's and don'ts. In fact, you might be surprised to find that you are one of them. Even if you don't visualize all aspects of English grammar as a table of do's and don'ts, and even if you don't go about pestering every English speaker or writer saying, don't do this instead, chances are that there are concepts or conventions that you've come to regard today as standard rules when they are more likely to simply be recommendations. Now, this view or this approach to grammar is what we call prescriptive grammar or the prescriptive approach to grammar. You may also see it called prescriptivism in some circles. Prescriptive grammar concerns itself with those rules recommended by prescriptivists, that's scholars and linguists, on how people should use a language in speaking and in writing. While they may not admit it, prescriptivists tend to treat grammar as though it were Bible and it's where their responsibility to dish out or prescribe commandments for language users to obey. If you learned English grammar as a child, chances are that you grew up learning some of these prescribed rules that have influenced the way you speak and particularly write today. So let's take a look at some of these prescribed rules in English grammar. The first on our list is the popular "Thou shalt not begin a sentence with a conjunction." Now, a conjunction is a word used to join two or more grammatical units like words, phrases, clauses, and so on. And some popular examples include but, and, for, so, and so on. Now, you might have grown up hearing someone say that it's ungrammatical to begin sentences using any of these conjunctions. On that note, let's take a look at the sentences below. Let's read them together. And that was how the movie ended. And yet, he refused to give up without a fight. But we all knew Sarah didn't love him. Or was it just a coincidence? So I decided to read the novel another day. Now take a look at these sentences carefully. Would you say they are grammatical or ungrammatical? Feel free to pause the video and take a moment to reflect. Now, if you said that these sentences are ungrammatical and I asked you why, chances are that you'd say just because, or you might use several words that would still be summarized as just because. And that's because you would be subscribing to the prescriptivist view that using conjunctions to begin a sentence is ungrammatical. That's because these prescriptivists believed that conjunctions are more of linkers. You know, they link two items, they link one clause to another, one word to another, and that since they are linkers, they should not be used to begin a sentence. However, English has been using conjunctions to begin sentences since time immemorial, even as far back as the Old English, as far back as books published by Shakespeare. Even the Bible has several sentences that begin with a conjunction. So that's something for you to think about. Another popular prescriptivist rule in English grammar is thou shalt not end the sentence with a preposition. Now, prepositions are those words used to show the relationship between two or more concepts, such as to, for, with, about, and so on. So, prescriptivists say we should not end sentences with any of these prepositions. Now, let's look at the following sentences below. This is the book I was looking for. Now, prescriptivists would say that this sentence is ungrammatical and would rather have you say, this is the book for which I was looking. Next on our list is, she's the one I was telling you about. Again, in this sentence, about is the preposition. So, some would argue that it is grammatical to say instead, she's the one about whom I was telling you. Next, we have, who are you talking to? Now, although there is nothing inherently wrong with that sentence, prescriptivists would argue that it is more grammatical or that it is simply grammatical to say, to whom are you talking? And then finally, we have, that's something I can't put up with. Now, prescriptivists in this case would argue that it's grammatical to say, that's something with which I can't put up. Another popular commandment in the prescriptivist Bible is, thou shalt not split an infinitive. Now, an infinitive is the base form of a verb. It's a verb in the original state before it is inflected to show its singularity or its tense. It's basically the original form of verbs as you would normally see them listed as major entries on a dictionary. You might have noticed that you'd see the verb listed as understand, help, eat, not necessarily understands or understood as a verb anyway, or helped, ate. We don't see it listed that way as major entries on the dictionary. You see them listed in this base form, and then the dictionary entry might add other details concerning their tense forms and their plural forms or singular forms, as the case may be. So infinitives, when you precede them by the preposition to, it's called a total infinitive or just an infinitive. But then when it doesn't have the t behind it, it's called a naked infinitive, or more precisely, a bare infinitive. Now, there is a prescriptive rule that suggests that we shouldn't split an infinitive. That is, when you have to understand, to help, to eat, don't insert an adverb between these two items. Now let's take a look at the sentences below. I want to really understand English grammar. She would like to genuinely help you. I have to quickly eat my food so I can complete my assignments. Now, you'd notice that in each of these three sentences, the infinitive has been split by an adverb, really, genuinely, and quickly, respectively. Now, put yourself in the shoes of a prescriptivist. How would you resolve these sentences without splitting the infinitives? Feel free to pause the video and try this out. Subscribing to the prescriptivist rule that says we shouldn't split an infinitive, one way to rewrite the first sentence is I really want to understand English grammar. Now, the second sentence that originally said she would like to genuinely help you, there are two ways we could go about this. We could say she would like genuinely to help you, or more commonly, she would genuinely like to help you. Finally, rather than say, I have to quickly eat my food so I can complete my assignments, a prescriptivist would have you say, I have to eat my food quickly so I can complete my assignments. Notice that in these three sentences, the adverb has been rearranged to allow the infinitive elements in each sentence to be more closely knit, to be together. Many a times, the reason we have prescriptive rules like this in English language is that some linguists, some prescriptivists try to force English to conform to the languages that influenced its form, particularly Latin. So in Old Latin, infinitives were usually one word. They weren't made up of two words, as in to help, to understand. They were usually one word. And prepositions never occurred at the end of sentences. They were always in the middle of sentences or at the beginning, as the case may be. So these prescriptivists, having some sort of elitist view about English and what it should be, would then recommend that it be used in a particular way that would make it as elitist or as formal as Latin. And then what you have are these recommendations that then become branded as grammar rules. Now, of course, sometimes people do see the merits in the convention a particular prescriptive rule is pushing for and decide to adapt their writing or their speech to that rule. But then there are other times when some people might decide not to use that particular convention, perhaps for creativity or autonomy or for whatever reasons they might have. So, in other words, there are cases when a prescriptivist rule might become so popular that it's adhered to by most, if not all, users of that language. But then there are also times when people might go contrary to a particular prescriptive rule. As in the examples we just looked at, some of those sentences most prescriptivists would say are wrong, are still being produced by everyday speakers of English. So this now brings us to another approach to grammar called the descriptive approach to grammar, or simply descriptive grammar. Now, if prescriptivism or prescriptive grammar looks at how people should use a language in speech or in writing, descriptive grammar looks at how they do use it in speech or in writing. So, on the one hand, a prescriptivist would say, don't write or say, this is the book I was looking for. But then the descriptive approach to grammar would assert that native speakers or users of English language do write and say, "This is the book I was looking for." Now, it's important to make this distinction for several reasons. The first of which is that over time, many students of English have come to associate learning grammar with learning prescribed rules. And so they would expect that when they're learning English grammar, all they should be learning about is what to say or write and what not to say or write. And so they've come to assume that every single rule in English grammar is a prescribed rule. But to hold this view would be to generalize because there are some rules in English grammar that are more or less recommendations, and doing things any other way may not necessarily be ungrammatical. And then there are other rules that are more like regularities, standard regularities or conventions that have become the norm over time. So, for instance, on the one hand, you have a rule that says do not end a sentence with a preposition. But then ending a sentence with a preposition isn't necessarily ungrammatical. And on the other hand, you have another rule that says we should use the past tense form of verbs when referring to actions that happened in the past, as in saying, I ate the food yesterday, not I eat the food yesterday. Now, to assume that grammar learning is all about learning prescribed rules would be to assume that that other rule, the one about past tense, is prescriptivism, that it's a prescribed rule, whereas it's a standard regularity, it's a standard grammatical rule rather than a recommendation. So it's important to make this distinction so that one can know which grammar rule is simply prescribed or a regulation and which other one is a regularity. Another reason why it's important to make this distinction between prescriptive grammar and descriptive grammar is that at this point, you might be under the assumption that prescriptive grammar encompasses all those grammar rules that are simply recommendations, and that descriptive grammar is simply all about standard rules, standard grammar rules. But that's not quite right. Now, prescriptive grammar does focus on recommended grammar rules that affect the form and the style of English grammar. That is correct. But then descriptive grammar doesn't necessarily look at whether the grammar is standard or not. It simply studies which grammar or which grammatical expressions native speakers or users of language in general simply use. So there are times when prescriptive grammar and descriptive grammar would overlap in certain expressions. Perhaps if there is a form that is recommended by prescriptivists that is obeyed or adhered to by most or maybe all users of that language, then that rule will be chalked down to prescriptivism because it's a prescribed rule, but it would also be listed or factored into descriptive grammar because that is the way the users of that language actually use the language. But then there are also times like the example with the preposition and the conjunction and the splitting of infinitives where prescriptivism or prescriptive grammar and descriptive grammar will not overlap because on the one hand you're having prescriptivists suggest a particular form that people don't always conform to. So in descriptive grammar we will account for all the various forms that are produced in actuality, but then prescriptivism will factor just the one prescribed form that people may not actually be producing. So, in summary, you can think of prescriptive grammar as regulations, that is, those rules that aim to regulate English grammar. And you can also think of descriptive grammar as regularities, that is, those grammar norms or conventions that happen to be a regularity. And I have the renowned English language teacher Scott Thunberry to thank for this clear cut distinction between prescriptivism and descriptivism. In his 2011 blog post, he described prescriptive grammar as rules as regulations and descriptive grammar as rules as regularities. But I felt the need to keep things simple and just call prescriptive grammar regulations and descriptive grammar as regularities. So now that we've seen how and why grammar is a system of rules and conventions rather than a checklist of prescribed do's and don'ts, why don't we look at the next part of the definition that we've been discussing so far? So now we have grammar is a system of rules guiding how words are formed. Now, when you're looking at word formation, what comes to mind is morphology. Now, morphology is the branch of grammar that studies how words are formed and how their forms change to express different meanings or grammatical functions. Basically, morphology looks at the structures that make up words, which are called morphemes, and then it looks at how these morphemes interact to make meaning. In linguistics, a morpheme is the smallest indivisible unit of meaning in a language. And there are basically two types of morphemes. You have free morphemes and you have bound morphemes. Now, free morphemes are those irreducible or indivisible morphemes that can stand on their own. They are independent. Good examples are cat, run, quick, he, and, my, and so on. All of these morphemes can stand on their own and either make meaning or carry out some form of grammatical function. And then you have bound morphemes, which are irreducible, but they depend on free morphemes to carry meaning or to make meaning. And some good examples are the following affixes: an, anti, or anti, depending on which version of English you're using, ness, li, and then the plural s, the possessive s, and the past tense marker ed, the past participle marker en, and so on. All these morphemes can't stand on their own to make meaning. They have to be attached to a free morpheme to make meaning. Now let's look at some examples of morphemes combining to make words. So we have the prefix an, which is a bound morpheme that needs to be attached to a free morpheme. Now, most of the time when you see this morpheme, it means not. So next we have the free morpheme happy, which we all know the meaning of happy to be in a state where you are pleased or you're in high spirits. And then next we have another bound morpheme, ness, which means the state of being a particular quality or feeling a particular thing or being a particular thing. And then we have these morphemes combined to form the word unhappiness, which is a state of not being happy. Now, notice that the Y in happy, the last letter, is changed to an I when it combines with ness to form unhappiness. Now, there are times like this when letters and particular morphemes will undergo a certain change to form larger words. We have this a lot with words ending with Y, like lazy, when lazy combines with ness to form laziness, the Y changes to an I. And then there are other times like where you might have a verb like organize, which ends with an E, but then it combines with ation to form organization, and the E is, just thrown away, so to speak. So do not assume that when you're combining morphemes, they have to retain their individual spelling because it's not always that way. Next, we have the morpheme boy, which is a young human. And then we have the bound morpheme s, which in this case is used to mark plurality. Now, both of these morphemes combine to form the word boys, which means more than one boy. It could be two, it could be three, it could be 1,000, but it is not one. We have many or several boys. Now let's go back to this first example, which has two bound morphemes. I'd like to show you two interesting aspects of bound morphemes. But for this first aspect, we're going to be using just the second bound morpheme in this example. So we have happy, the free morpheme, and we have ness, the bound morpheme. Now, in this particular example, what would you say is the word class of happy? And by word class, I mean part of speech. What part of speech would you say the happy likely belongs to in this sentence or in this example? Feel free to pause the video and give it some thought. Now, in this example, happy is an adjective. Now, notice that when happy combines with ness to form happiness, this resulting word is a noun, not an adjective. But if we were to neglect the second bound morpheme and focus on just the first bound morpheme, which is un, we see that un combines with happy, which is, remember, an adjective, to form unhappy, which is also an adjective. Now, why is this interesting? Well, let's take a look at the free morpheme in this example, which is happy. Now, when you add ness to happy, remember happy means feeling pleased or joyous or excited, being in a like feeling so good about something. Now, when you add ness to happy, the meaning doesn't really shift away from that. It just says that okay, this person or this entity is now in a state of being happy. So what changes really is the word class, not necessarily the meaning. But then when you add un to happy to form unhappy, the meaning now has changed. So this person is no longer in high spirits. They are in low spirits. They are unhappy. They are upset. They may be angry as the case may be, but they are no longer in a state where you can associate them with the feelings that normally come with happiness. So in other words, there are times when you would add a bound morpheme to a free morpheme and the word class would change. And there are times when you'd add another bound morpheme to a free morpheme and the meaning would change. And there, of course, there are times when both of those would change. Now, bound morphemes that change either the meaning or the word class or both of those of a word are called derivational bound morphemes. Now let's take a look at the second example where we have boy, which is a noun, and boy combines with the plural marker, which is a bound morpheme, s, to form boys. Now, what is the word class of boys? Would you say it has changed in this sentence or in this example, or would you say it remains the same? Now, boys, like boy, is still a noun. And if we were to look at another example in a different word class, let's try a verb for this example. So we have the verb know, which combines with s to form the verb knows. Now in this case, the word class still remains the same. Now, unlike derivational bound morphemes, there are those bound morphemes that don't really change the word class of a word or of a free morpheme, but just add some kind of grammatical function. They inflect the free morpheme to show a grammatical function or a grammatical marker. Now, such bound morphemes are referred to as inflectional bound morphemes. Now, keep in mind that unlike the boy example, the boy and the boys example, where the s is a plural marker, in this example with the verb know, the s is actually a singular marker. In other words, knows is a singular verb, not a plural verb. If you're confused, that's okay. Students usually struggle with this aspect when it comes to subject verb agreement, which is why I'm going to take my time to briefly explain the difference between a noun and a verb when it comes to singularity and plurality. When it comes to subject verb agreement in English grammar, the standard rule is that singular subjects take on singular verbs and plural subjects take on plural verbs. Now, take a look at this sentence. the boy knows the girl. Now we have the subject, the noun phrase, the boy, and we have the verb, which is knows. Now, would you say the subject is singular or plural? And which would you say for the verb? Now, in this sentence, the boy is referring to just a single entity, a single boy. So the boy here is singular, it's a singular subject, and knows is the right verb to use for a subject that is singular. So it's a singular verb. But now take a look at these other sentence, the pluralized version of this sentence. You have the boys know the girl. Now, in this sentence, the subject is now plural. You have the boys, and then the appropriate verb to use here is know. So, this is a plural verb, know, unlike the singular version, which has an S. So, at this point now, you might have noticed the difference between a noun and a verb when it comes to singularity or plurality. That is, unlike a noun, which generally doesn't use an S when it's singular, but typically uses an S when it's plural. Mind you, not every noun is like that. You have child, and the plural is children, not childs. But then generally, the plural form will take an S, unlike verbs, which add an S for singular verbs, but then omit the S for plural verbs. So it helps to just note this difference. And to make it easier for you, I've added a table for you to screenshot and study in your spare time. So now we've seen how grammar is a system of rules guiding how words are formed. We've seen how morphology comes into play and how different types of morphemes, that's the bound morphemes and the free morphemes, combine to form words. Next, let's look at the remainder of this definition. So now we have grammar is a system of rules guiding how words are formed, combined, and arranged to form higher grammatical units like phrases, clauses, and sentences. Now, this is the full definition that we've been discussing or dissecting in parts so far in this video. Now, when you look at how morphemes combine to form words, what you're thinking about or what you're looking at is morphology. But when you look at how those words are combined in a particular order or how they are arranged to form higher grammatical units such as phrases, clauses, and even sentences, what you're looking at now is syntax. And in grammar, syntax is such an integral aspect. It's because we have syntax that you can't just arrange words haphazardly. You can't arrange words anyhow and expect to have a grammatical sentence. Think of the sentence we used earlier, dog the likely her. And remember, I said I would explain later why that sentence is ungrammatical. But before I do that, feel free to give it a shot. Give the sentence a very good look and try to determine why it's ungrammatical. Now, there are several ways to tackle this sentence to expose why it's ungrammatical, but perhaps the easiest way would be to label the word class that each word in this sentence belongs to. Now, a disclaimer: some words belong to various word classes, and the specific word class they function as at a given time will depend on the context in which they are used. For instance, dog here could be a noun referring to the furry animal that we all love, but then it could also be a verb, as in to dog someone, which means to stalk someone, to follow them in a harassing way. But then in this particular sentence, even though this sentence doesn't really make much sense, we can argue, perhaps because of its closeness to the, that dog here is probably a noun. So I'm just going to list it here as a noun. And then we have the, which is a determiner, it's the definite article the. And then we have likely here, and I'm just going to say that it's an adverb in this particular sentence, and then we have the pronoun her. Now that I've listed the word classes of these words, can you figure out why the sentence itself is ungrammatical? Feel free to pause the video and give it a shot. Now, to start with, you have a determiner followed by an adverb. However, in English, a determiner always follows a noun. You have the dog, the boy, a girl, an orange, never orange an, or an fast. I mean, you could say a fast, but you can't leave it that way. It has to be followed by a noun. So, a fast dog, a fast cat, a fast car. You can't just say a fast, or in this case, dog day, because you've just followed a noun with an item that should come before it in syntax. So, that's one reason now why this sentence is particularly problematic. And then perhaps the biggest reason why this sentence might be ungrammatical or is ungrammatical is that it's missing the one element that every sentence must have. And I'll tell you what that is in a bit. But before then, keep in mind that there are various models of grammar. There is traditional grammar, which you probably learned in secondary school if you did English grammar in secondary school. And by the way, I say probably not as a shade to your secondary school, but I just have to consider that there might be some people who might be learning English as a second language watching this video and are just getting to know English grammar. So, anyway, there is traditional grammar, and then there are other models like systemic functional grammar and transformational generative grammar. Now, these grammar models have their similarities as well as their differences. But let's start by looking at the elements that make up the structure of traditional grammar, since it's probably what you are most familiar with. Now, for traditional grammar, we have the popular SVOCA, where S stands for subject, V stands for verb, and then we have the object, the complement, and the adjunct in this order. Now, this doesn't mean that every sentence must have these five elements or that they must be ordered this particular way. It's just that these are the five elements that are then combined in various formats, usually beginning with an S that is the subject, although not entirely, not always. But then usually it begins with a subject and then a verb, and then it could stop there or it could combine the other elements in various other formats to generate certain structural formulas that various producible sentences in English language align with. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail about the sentence structural formulas we have in traditional grammar. That's for another video. But I will reference it now and then to show you why certain sentences may be grammatical or ungrammatical. Now, the next grammar model on our list is systemic functional grammar, which has the structural formula of SPCA. I should note that unlike traditional grammar and even the next one we will look at, transformational generative grammar, SFG doesn't focus on form quite like the other two do. But then when you try to box it into a formula, it's safe to say that it aligns more with SPCA, where the verb in traditional grammar has been replaced with another term called a predicator, and the object and complement in traditional grammar have become fused to be called simply the complement. Now, try not to confuse a predicator with a predicate. In traditional grammar, you might have been taught that a sentence is made up of a subject and the predicate, which refers to the rest of the sentence other than the subject. However, a predicator is the verb or verb phrase that begins the predicate. Students often confuse the two, but you don't want to make that mistake, especially in an exam. Moving on, we have transformational generative grammar, which has a structural formula of S inflection NP VP. Now, what this simply means is that a sentence is made up of a noun phrase and a verb phrase. TGG, that is Transformational Generative Grammar, was proposed by the American professor Noam Chomsky, while SFG was proposed by the late British linguist Michael Halliday. Now, in all three grammar models, all but one of the elements that make up their structural formulas are optional. The other one that isn't optional has to be in a sentence for it to be grammatical. Now remember I said earlier that there's an element that dog the likely her is missing, which makes it ungrammatical. Now, looking at these elements on the screen, can you figure out which one of them in each grammar model that's compulsory to make a sentence or a grammatical sentence? Feel free to pause the video as you think about it. So, the sentence element that is mandatory to make a grammatical sentence in the syntax of various grammar models is the verb or its equivalent. So, in traditional grammar, that's simply the verb, but in SFG, that's the predicator, and in TGG, that's the verb phrase. Now, this isn't to say that once a sentence has a verb or a verb phrase, that it's grammatical, but then at the very least, a grammatical sentence should have a verb or a predicator or a verb phrase. Now, circling back to our focus sentence, dog, the likely her, you can see that of all the four word classes listed here, the verb is missing. The verb isn't among them. So this couldn't possibly be a grammatical sentence. But remember, a sentence isn't the only thing that words combine to form. Words can also combine to form phrases, and you can have certain phrases like noun phrases, which can still be grammatical without a verb. Now, at this point, a good question to ask is what if dog the likelihood isn't a sentence? What if it's a phrase instead? Would it be grammatical then? And that's a very good question. But just like we have with sentences, even phrase structures have certain elements that determine whether or not they're grammatical. Now, keeping things simple, there's what we call the MHQ structure, where M stands for modifier, H stands for head word, and the Q stands for qualifier. Now, this is very similar to your SVOCA structural formula in traditional grammar for sentences, where you have these particular elements, and a sentence doesn't necessarily have to contain all of them, but it should have a verb to be grammatical. Now, in this case, a phrase should have at least a head word to be grammatical. Now, what is the modifier? What is the head word? What is the qualifier? And does this expression, dog the likely her, have it? To answer this question, let's take a look at another sentence. The black dog in the classroom belongs to me. Now, let's try to break down this sentence using TGG, but we won't go in depth, just breaking it down into the noun phrase and the verb phrase. So feel free to pause the video and give it a shot if you want. In the sentence, what do you think is the noun phrase and what do you think is the verb phrase? Now, in this sentence, the noun phrase is the black dog in the classroom. That's the subject of the sentence. And then you have the verb phrase belongs to me. The verb phrase can also be interchanged or interchangeable with the predicate of a sentence. But the verb itself belongs, that is the predicator. Now, generally, when it comes to phrases, the modifier and the qualifier aren't so different. They are different, but they aren't so different. The both of them add more information to the head word, but then the modifier usually comes before the head word while the qualifier comes after the head word. And then the head word is that word in a phrase on which the other elements converge and which points to which word class that phrase belongs to. So, in other words, in a noun phrase, the head word would be a noun. In a prepositional phrase, the head word would be a preposition. And in the verb phrase here, belongs to me, the head word is the verb belongs, while to me, which adds more detail. Who does the dog belong to? Or who does the dog in the classroom belong to? It belongs to me. So to me in this phrase, in this verb phrase, is the qualifier. Similarly, in the noun phrase, the black dog in the classroom, the black is the modifier. It tells us more about the dog that we are talking specifically about the dog that is black. Dog itself here is the head word, and you can see that it's a noun, which makes sense because the black dog in the classroom is a noun phrase, while in the classroom is a qualifier. Now, you could further break down this into another phrase. In the classroom itself, that's a prepositional phrase, and you'd notice that in is a preposition, which makes sense because in this case, now in becomes the head word of that prepositional phrase, while the classroom is the qualifier. But this is in the video for phrase structures. We might cover that someday soon, or maybe not in this beginner playlist, perhaps in an advanced level playlist that I will create as time goes on. But now back to the expression we're interested in, which is dog the likely hair. Can you now, with what you've learned about MHQ structure, can you determine whether or not this is a phrase? And if you say it's a phrase, what kind of phrase? Is it a noun phrase? Is it an adjective phrase? Or rather, is it an adjectival phrase? Or is it a prepositional phrase? Or perhaps a verb phrase? Now, keep in mind that whatever phrase you say it is, the head word should point or should align with that phrase, just as I showed in the example with the noun phrase and how its head word is a noun. So feel free to pause this video and just, think about this for a sec. It would seem that just like the sentence structural formula SVOCA, MHQ here also shows how insensible this expression is. Because you have dog, which makes you want to think that it's a noun phrase, but then the modifier, which should come before dog, comes after, which is the same issue we talked about when discussing how determiners come before nouns, not after. So even using the MHQ structure, this expression doesn't have a clear head word on which other elements converge. So this isn't a phrase, nor is it a clause or a sentence. And if it's where any of that, well, it's an ungrammatical sentence or phrase. Now, at this point, you might be wondering what exactly makes a sentence grammatical or ungrammatical? Because I mean, you've seen me do all this analysis using sentence structure and even phrase structure, and you might be overwhelmed or intimidated. And if you're not, I mean, kudos to you. But then you might be, and you think that it's really challenging and overwhelming, but I promise you, it really isn't. So, to help you understand how to tell whether a sentence may be grammatical or ungrammatical, we're going to look at just a few more sentence examples. Now, I would like you to study these two sentences very carefully, very thoroughly, and decide which one of the two is or are grammatical or ungrammatical. And I don't want you to guess. Really get into it, really study them and decide why you think which one is grammatical or not. So go ahead and pause the video and take all the time you need to think. Now we're going to be examining two of these sentences using two models. We're going to be using the basic version of TGG, and I say basic because in TGG usually you have a tree diagram that breaks sentences down past the noun phrase, verb phrase level, but we're going to just be stopping there because we're keeping things simple. So we're going to be using TGG and traditional grammar to test if these sentences have a grammatical structure. So let's take a closer look at the first sentence. The children are playing outside. Try to divide the sentence or break it down into a noun phrase and a verb phrase. Now, in this sentence, the noun phrase is the children, while the rest of the sentence is the predicate, also known as the verb phrase. But now, using traditional grammar structural formula, which is SVOCA, try to break this one down, break the sentence down into its various elements. So in this sentence, the children is the subject. It's the one performing the action. But can you figure out what the verb is? Now, if you say just plain, you would be wrong because are is also a verb. It's an auxiliary verb. So you want to take are playing together and say that that's the verb. But then what element does outside belong to? Is it a complement? Is it an object? Or is it an adjunct? In this sentence, outside is an adjunct, specifically an adverb of place. It is telling us where the children are playing. So this sentence has a structural formula of SVA, which is a standard formula in the SVOCA umbrella structure. Now, we've not covered sentence structure yet. I've not covered the various formulas. So this might be new knowledge to you, but just know that SVA is a correct, it's a grammatical structure in traditional grammar. So what exactly does this mean? Well, it means that both TGG and traditional grammar agreed that this sentence is grammatical. Now let's take a look at the other sentence. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Now, would you say this sentence is grammatical or ungrammatical? Why don't we examine it using TGG and traditional grammar sentence structural formulas just as we did earlier for the first sentence? Now ask yourself if we can break down this sentence into a distinct noun phrase and a distinct verb phrase. Now in this sentence, colorless green ideas is the noun phrase and ideas is the noun, which is the head word. It's the main word in this phrase, while colorless green is the modifier. And then sleep furiously is the verb phrase. Now, it doesn't matter that colorless green doesn't seem to make sense or that it's weird to picture someone sleeping furiously. What we want to concern ourselves with, especially when we're looking at noun phrase, verb phrase, is whether the way it is structured makes it an actual noun phrase or a verb phrase? Like, does the noun phrase have what it needs to be called a noun phrase? In this case, yes, you have ideas, which is the head word, and you have the modifier. A noun phrase can have mh, it can have a modifier and a head word, but not necessarily a qualifier. So yes, it's a noun phrase. And then here you have a verb phrase which can stand as a verb or have an adverb after the verb. So in this case, sleep furiously is a verb phrase. So yes, the noun phrase is present and okay. The verb phrase is also present and okay. So the sentence is grammatical as far as TGG is concerned. But why don't we look at what traditional grammar has to say with its own sentence structure? Now, at this point, we want to check if there is a clear subject in the sentence, that is, something performing an action, and if there is a clear verb, that is, a verb expressing the action grammatically, and if there are any elements that might follow the verb. So ask yourself, does this sentence have a subject? Well, just like in the other example where the noun phrase also is the subject, in this sentence, colorless green ideas is also the subject. And then sleep is the verb of the sentence, while furiously is an adjunct, particularly an adverb of manner. It is telling you how colorless green ideas are sleeping. Now, looking at this structure, this expression that we've constructed, what you want to check is whether the subject and the verb agree, especially in terms of number, that is singularity or plurality. Now, colorless green ideas, that's definitely a plural subject. And sleep doesn't have the S, so it's the plural verb, which means they agree. And then sleep is also an intransitive verb, which means it does not attract a direct object. It is not like slap which is a transitive verb and attracts an object. You can't just say, I slap. You have to say who you slapped. But then sleep is intransitive. You don't say, I sleep him. So if you should add anything, it should be perhaps an adverb to tell us how you slept. I slept well, I slept beautifully, or in this case, colorless green ideas, sleep furiously. So, as far as function and form are concerned, there is nothing ungrammatical about this sentence. So, traditional grammar also agrees that this sentence, even though it doesn't seem like it makes sense, is still grammatical. Now, at this point, what you want to note down is that grammaticality or ungrammaticality doesn't really depend on meaning, it depends on structure. If the structure is grammatical, that is, if it conforms to the rules and the conventions about sentences, phrases, structure in general, morphology and syntax, then that expression is grammatical, whether or not it makes sense. This becomes even easier to understand when you consider the fact that in poetry, we often use certain expressions that may not seem to make sense, but will still be grammatical, and one might even impose metaphorical meanings on them. In fact, if you think hard enough, I'm pretty sure you might be able to think of a figurative meaning to impose on how colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Now let's look at this fresh batch of sentences. Take your time to go through all six of them. Pause the video if you have to. Ask yourself which one of them is grammatical and which one isn't grammatical. And now that you know what makes a sentence grammatical or ungrammatical, try to have really good reasons behind your opinion concerning whether or not any of these sentences is grammatical or ungrammatical. Now, the first sentence reads, the book on the table is mine own. How can we tell if this sentence is grammatical or ungrammatical? Now, remember, it all boils down to structure. And there are times when we can look at the structure from a broader perspective, at a less narrow focus, such as we've been doing so far, considering noun phrase, considering it at the phrase level. But sometimes, as in the example with the determiner, remember in dog the likely her, and how I said that the fact that the determiner which should come before the noun comes after the noun and was already pointed that that sentence was ungrammatical. Well, there are times when you can focus on the sentence at word level and have a really good clue as to whether or not it is grammatical. And this sentence is one of such sentences. Now, the issue with this sentence is at the very end. You have mine and you have own. Now, mine is a possessive pronoun, but in this sentence, it is trying to function like a possessive determiner, which is an error. So the sentence isn't grammatical. What you want to say instead is the book on the table is mine, or the book on the table is my own. You don't use a pronoun before a noun, which doesn't make sense when you think about it because a pronoun is supposed to be used instead of a noun. So it's quite problematic when you use a pronoun before a noun that it should be replacing and referring to because that's just redundant. So you either use the pronoun, which is mine alone, or you use the appropriate determiner, the appropriate possessive determiner, which is my before own. And then you'd have a grammatical sentence. Now let's take a look at this other sentence. The doctor suggested that she go home. Now, would you say this sentence is grammatical or ungrammatical? Feel free to pause the video and just give it some thought. Now, like many students, you might think that go in this sentence should be goes, as in the doctor suggested that she goes home, or the doctor suggested that she went home. But then those expressions would be ungrammatical As a matter of fact, this sentence is grammatical the way it is because there's something called the mandative subjunctive concord when it comes to subject verb agreement, which states that when you have a verb that expresses a suggestion or a recommendation, a command or a prayer or a wish, and so on, the verb that follows should be in its base form, that is, in its bare infinitive form. Remember, I said that the bare infinitive is when you have a verb in its base form without the to behind it. So basically, the base form of a verb. So not past tense, just the verb in its base form. So it is correct to use go, not any inflected form of go, such as goes or went. So this sentence is grammatical. Next, we have between you and me, the exam was too easy. Now, would you say this sentence is grammatical or ungrammatical, and why? Feel free to pause the video and give it some thought. Now, when it comes to sentences like this, the usual dilemma is whether to say you and me or you and I. But now let's look at both options carefully. So, is it simply grammatical to say between you and I? Now, one reason why most people would say yes is that they see between you and I, or they see that particular phrase occur at the beginning of the sentence. And so they think, oh, well, that's a subject, seeing as it occurs at the beginning of the sentence, and seeing as I is the subjective case when it comes to pronouns. I is the subject for personal pronouns, while me is the object. And so they think it has to be you and I. Now, the good part about that is that at least these people are thinking in the right line, in that they are considering the case, that is whether it is the subjective, also known as the nominative case, or the objective case. They're considering which case the pronoun is functioning as. However, in this particular structure, you and I, both of them are actually the object of the preposition between. So it would be erroneous to use I because that's the object position. Think of it like this: you won't say between she and they, you'd say between her and them. She and they are also subjective pronouns, subject pronouns, right? And her and them are both object pronouns or objective pronouns. You won't say between she and we, you'd say between her and us. So if we can't use the subjective pronouns of these other pronouns in these cases, one could argue that that's all the more reason to use the objective case for the personal pronoun in this example. Moreover, prepositions typically attract the objective forms of pronouns generally. You do not say share the oranges between she and he. You say share the oranges between him and her. So it's grammatical to say between you and me, the exam was too easy. Now take a look at this sentence. Me and my friend went to class early. Now, would you say this sentence is grammatical or ungrammatical? As usual, feel free to pause and just give it some thought. Now, the problem with this particular sentence lies in its subject. In the subject position, you have me, which is the personal pronoun, but then used in object positions. You don't say, me went to class early, just as you don't say, her went to class early. You use subject pronouns such as I, she, he, and so on. So in this sentence, it would be grammatical to say, my friend and I went to class early. Next on our list is a very tricky sentence. It says, whom are you talking to? Now, would you say this sentence is grammatical or ungrammatical? Now, the first thing you want to figure out is what exactly is the subject of this sentence? Is it whom? Now, to figure out the subject, keep in mind that the subject of a sentence is the entity or the person or the thing performing an action or being in a particular state. And that state or action is always expressed by the verb in the sentence. So, in this sentence, the verb is talking. Now, you want to ask yourself, who is talking? Is it whom or is it you? Now, in this sentence, the subject is you. You is the one talking. In fact, this sentence is actually you are talking to someone. We don't know who. We just know that that person is a noun or that thing is a noun, and then it is being replaced with a pronoun in this sentence. In this case, that pronoun is whom. So we could say that the sentence is originally you are talking to whom, but then it is rearranged to form the question, whom are you talking to? On that note, what we want to figure out now is whether whom is the right pronoun to use in the objective case. It turns out that it is. When you have this particular pronoun used in the subject case, you use who, but when it occurs in the object position, you use whom. So technically, it is grammatical to say, whom are you talking to? The only reason I felt the need to highlight it in red is that it's not a very common expression. In fact, prescriptive grammar would say that it is grammatical to say, to whom are you talking? Which takes us back to the thou shalt not end a sentence with the preposition rule. Interestingly, in everyday English grammar, or in everyday English, people are more likely to say, who are you talking to? Which is using who, the subject form, instead of the object form. This might not be grammatical, but it has become accepted in everyday English or in informal English. So you could freely use this in your everyday speech, in your very casual writing, but I wouldn't recommend using it in academic essays or, very formal writing. Next, we have he spoke as though he were her boss. Now, would you say this sentence is grammatical or ungrammatical? Now, let's look at the part of this sentence that most people usually struggle with, which is the verb were. The dispute is often whether to use was or were, as in, should we say he spoke as though he was a boss or he spoke as though he were her boss? Now, there's something called the subjunctive mood in English, which is used to express unreal or hypothetical situations. Now, when you have a hypothetical situation and you're referring to a past action or a past hypothetical situation, the rule is to use were instead of was. So you want to say, he spoke as though he were her boss. This is also why we say, if I were you, not if I was you. Now let's take a look at this second batch of sentences. And feel free to pause the video and go through each one. Try to determine which one is grammatical or ungrammatical. And it's good practice to have a very good reason behind your answers rather than just, guess. The first sentence says, the girls, the boys, or the woman is coming. And would you say this sentence is grammatical or ungrammatical? It's very common to see sentences like this and assume that because you have three items before the verb, that the subject is plural. Like in this case, you might think that we have three subjects. But let's look at it very closely. It says the girls, the boys, or the woman is coming. Now, it says or the woman, not and the woman. So, in other words, not all of them are coming. It's got to be one of them. Now, there's this rule in Concord called the proximity concord, and it's applicable for cases like this. It states that when you have subjects joined with the conjunction or rather than and, that the verb agrees with the subject nearest to it. So in this case, the girls, the boys, or the woman The woman here is the subject that is closest to the verb. So since it's a singular subject, the verb has to be singular, and is here is singular, which is what makes it grammatical. It would be wrong to say the girls, the boys, or the woman are coming. Now, if it were and the woman, definitely it would be are coming. Similarly, if the sentence read instead the woman, the girls, or the boys, it would be correct to say are coming because now boys or the boys is the subject closest to the verb. So, in a nutshell, this sentence is grammatical. Next, we have the list of students are on the desk. Now, would you say this sentence is grammatical or ungrammatical? Now, the first thing you want to do is to ask yourself, what is the subject in this sentence? And if you've been paying attention so far, then you'd know that it's the noun phrase, the list of students. Now, the next thing you want to figure out is this a singular or a plural subject? Well, for one, we know that what is on the desk is not the students, it's the list of students. In other words, even though the noun phrase, the list of students, is the subject, the main subject is the list. If we were to break it down using MHQ structure, the would be the modifier, list would be the noun, and of students would be the qualifier. So list is what we are focusing on in this phrase, in this subject, and list is a singular noun. It's one list of students. So in other words, the verb has to be singular. So it should be the list of students is on the desk, which would then be grammatical. Next on our list is the sentence, each of the girls have their own pair of shoes. Now, would you say this sentence is grammatical or ungrammatical? And why? Now, just like before, you want to look at the subject and determine if it's a singular or a plural subject. Now, in this sentence, the subject is the noun phrase, each of the girls. Now, is that a singular or a plural subject? But I'll save you the stress and just tell you that it's a singular subject because we're not talking about all of the girls, we're talking about each one of the girls. So each of the girls, it's a singular subject, which already tells you that that verb that the verb have is the wrong verb to use because it's a plural verb. You say they have, we have. The singular verb is has. The correct singular verb to use is has, as in she has, each one of the girls has, not each one of the girls have. And then even the pronoun there doesn't really agree in this case. It doesn't agree with the subject because the subject is the female, it's a female noun or a feminine noun. And so the pronoun should be her instead of the neuter or plural there. So the correct sentence to use in this case would be each of the girls has her own pair of shoes. Now take a look at the next sentence. Hannah sings more better than her sister. Would you say that sentence is grammatical or ungrammatical? Feel free to pause the video and really give this one some thought. Now, the issue with this sentence lies in the phrasing of its adverb, more better. And yes, more better or better is functioning as an adverb in this sentence, not an adjective. And you'll come to see why that is real soon. But before we talk about how or why it's an adverb and why it's phrased wrongly, let's do a quick crash course on adjectives, particularly regular adjectives. Now, regular adjectives are those adjectives whose comparative and superlative forms are either formed by adding er and est respectively or by adding more and most before the adjective. For instance, you have tall, taller, tallest. And you can also say beautiful, more beautiful, most beautiful. Usually we use more and most for those adjectives that are longer than two syllables. This isn't an absolute rule. There might be exceptions, but it's something I've noticed about adjectives. Now, it's erroneous to combine both formats. Adjectives that have the er and est do not take more and most before them. You do not say more taller, most tallest. It's just taller, tallest. Just as you don't say more beautifuler, most beautifulest. You just say more beautiful, most beautiful. And adverbs aren't any different. You can say he runs more quickly than her. The dog runs more quickly than the cat. And you can also say the dog runs faster than the cat. But you do not say the dog runs more faster than the cat, because that would be combining the two formats, which would be wrong. And this sentence does it. It does just this. So it says Hannah sings more better than her sister, when the right thing to say would be simply Hannah sings better than her sister. Or if you would like to emphasize the degree to how much better she sings, then you could say Hannah sings much better than her sister, because in this case much is not a comparative adjective, it's just more like an intensifier. Now, in case you're still wondering why this is an adverb, not an adjective, bear in mind that better in this case is modifying the verb sings. It's telling you how Hannah sings. And adverbs modify verbs. Adjectives don't modify verbs. That's why better in this case is an adverb. Remember, I said that there are some words that can belong to various word classes depending on the context. So, in this particular context, the word better is functioning as an adverb. Next, we have $10 is enough to buy her lunch. Now, would you say this sentence is grammatical or ungrammatical? I can see why this might be confusing. You're looking at $10 and you're probably wondering, so now is this a singular or a plural subject? Well, the thing about English grammar is that when it comes to subject verb agreement or concord, such quantities as time, money, and even distance are treated as single units. So you would say 5 kilometers is the distance between point A and point B. You'd say 5 hours is all I need. You'd say 10 minutes is all I'm asking for, not 10 minutes are all I'm asking for. And so in this case, it is grammatical to say $10 is enough to buy her lunch, not $10 are enough to buy her lunch. So, yes, this sentence is grammatical. And last but not least on this list is the sentence the president, together with his wife and children, has arrived. Now, would you say this sentence is grammatical or ungrammatical? Now, this sentence isn't so different from the one we have above, the one about the girls, the boys, or the women, in that you have a list of what looks like so many subjects, and then you can't help but wonder if the subject isn't plural. But then there is a rule in Concord, in subject verb agreement, that states that when you have a subject joined with other entities using a preposition or a complex preposition, for example, like with, together with, along with, and so on, we treat the subjects that come after the preposition as some kind of like parenthetical elements, in that they're not given equal importance as the main subject. So we kind of like neglect them when considering what verb to use. We just focus on the main subject. And if it's singular, we use a singular verb. If it's plural, we use a plural verb. So in this case, together with his wife and children is treated, that phrase is treated as a parenthetical element. And then we focus on the president as the main subject. And since the president is a singular subject, we look at the verb and ask ourselves, Is it singular as well? And in this case, it is. Has is a singular verb. And that's what makes this sentence grammatical. Now, in a later video, I'll definitely cover several of the rules of Concord, but I can't do that in this video. Still, if you have any questions concerning this particular rule or any other ones I've covered so far, feel free to express your concerns or ask your questions in the comment section, and I'll definitely respond once I get the chance. So at this point, I hope that the next time you see this definition of grammar or a similar definition of grammar, that it won't look like gibberish to you, and that you'd know what to check for, you'd know what to look for in the definition to know if it's a good definition, and that if, when you see a bad definition, you'd be able to criticize it thoroughly, intelligently, academically, and point out why that definition might not be very encompassing, or why it's not a good definition. By now you must have figured out that the two main components of grammar are morphology and syntax. Now, these two come together to form what is known as grammar in any language, and that includes English. Now, we've spent nearly 2 hours talking about grammar, and if it weren't so important, well, we wouldn't have devoted so much time talking about it. So, why should you care about grammar anyway? Now, if you're watching this video, chances are that you're either a student studying English in university, or perhaps at secondary school level, or perhaps you're learning English as a second language, or maybe you're just curious about English language. But regardless of which demographic you fall into, studying the grammar of any language, but since we're focusing on English in this video, studying English grammar has so many benefits that you stand to gain. And the first benefit is that it helps you clarify meaning in language. Now, to illustrate, take a look at these two sentences. On the one hand, we have let's eat grammar, and on the other hand, we also have let's eat grammar. Now, the only difference between these two sentences is the comma in the first sentence. Now, take a look at these sentences carefully. What would you say each one of them means? Or more precisely, what difference does the comma make in meaning? Now, in the first sentence, we are attributing the first two words to grammar. We are inviting grammar to join us and eat. But in the second sentence, we are suggesting to someone else or to a group of people that we should eat grammar. So in the first sentence, grammar is being invited to lunch or dinner. But in the second sentence, grammar is lunch or dinner. So punctuation is such an integral aspect of grammar, and you've just seen how we can use it to make meaning, the intended meaning, much clearer in a particular context. Now let's take a look at this sentence we explored just a few minutes earlier. $10 is enough to buy her lunch. Now, when you study this sentence very carefully, you might notice that there are several possible interpretations to it. But in this video, we're going to look at just two of them. Now, on the one hand, focus on the phrase after buy, that's her lunch. On the one hand, in that phrase, her could be the indirect object, while lunch could be the direct object. So we are buying lunch for her. So you're saying that $10 is enough to buy her lunch. In other words, $10 is enough to buy lunch for her. But on the other hand, it could be that her lunch, that phrase, is simply the direct object. It's what we are buying. So you are saying that $10 is enough to buy her lunch. If we were to put a price on her lunch, $10 would be enough to buy it. Now, this phenomenon where a grammatical unit has multiple interpretations is known as ambiguity. And an ambiguity can exist or can occur at the lexical level, that's at the level of a word. For instance, saying he's a funny man, and funny can mean humorous or strange. And it can also exist at the syntactic level, that's at the sentence level, in that you see a sentence constructed and then you have to wonder what exactly a particular word, one of its elements, is functioning as. Because if it's functioning in a particular way, as in we just saw, if it's a direct object or an indirect object, it can affect the meaning somehow. A very popular example of syntactic ambiguity is the sentence, I saw the man with the telescope. So, are you saying that you used the telescope to see the man, or are you saying that you saw the man holding a telescope? Now, this is one benefit of grammar. It's by understanding the various ways that sentences, or words rather, can function in a sentence or in a phrase or in a clause. You get to interrogate these expressions to extract their meaning. Now, let's look at some other sentences with syntactic ambiguity. First, we have flying planes can be dangerous. Now, feel free to pause the video and try to discern how many possible meanings you can extract from this sentence. Now, I'm only going to focus on two. First, this sentence could treat flying planes as a gerund, that is, a noun phrase formed from a verb, as in, the act of flying planes can be dangerous. On the other hand, it could be treating flying as an adjective, as in, planes that are flying, flying planes, can be dangerous. Now let's look at this other sentence. A decision was taken on the boat. Now, similarly, this opens us to several possible interpretations. On the one hand, on the boat could be a prepositional phrase functioning as an adverbial, telling us the location or the place where the decision was made. And on the other hand, it could be that a decision was taken, about the boat. We took a decision on the boat. So, understanding English grammar, just like with the earlier examples, helps you ask the right questions about how a particular word or group of words might be functioning in a particular sentence, to help you further clarify the intended meaning or the several possible meanings that one could attribute to the sentence or the clause or the phrase, as the case may be. Other than help us clarify meaning, there are other benefits that come with learning grammar. The first of which is that it gives us a deeper understanding of how language works, which is something called competence, well, a loose definition for competence. Competence in linguistics is a language uses knowledge about how language works. It's like everything you know about language, and grammar can really aid you when you understand the grammar, the structural framework of a language. It can give you a deeper understanding of how that language works, which leads us to the next benefit, something called performance, better performance. Now, performance in linguistics is your practical application of competence. It's what you know and then use. It's like, so on the one hand, you could know all these grammar rules and you could know all of this, and that's your competence. But then when you're producing it in speech and in writing, well, that's your performance. And it's a no-brainer. The better you know about, or the more you know about English grammar, the better you get to use it in your speech and writing. So learning grammar helps you make more grammatical expressions in speech and in writing. And at this point now, feel free to just wonder, when I said it makes you make more grammatical sentences, am I saying sentences that are more grammatical, or am I saying that you'd create more grammatical sentences? This is another case of ambiguity. But yeah, moving on. Grammar also helps you think more critically, just like we did with all those sentence examples we looked at earlier. You don't just see a sentence and assume that a particular word belongs to a particular word class, or that it's functioning in a particular way, or that it's grammatical. You actually sit down and you think critically, you assess it critically. So, understanding grammar has massive benefits for your critical thinking. And finally, learning grammar can serve as a transferable skill to fields like translation, communication, education, content creation, and editing. Understanding grammar has helped me immeasurable as a copy editor and a proofreader. And Even literature, even as a creative writer, one might think that because of, say, poetic license, that you can, one would say there's no point in really giving grammar so much emphasis since you have the license to break grammar rules in poetry and so on. But one would argue that understanding grammar can actually enrich your writing. It helps to know the rules before you break them at the very least. Because then when you break them, it won't be because of ignorance, but it will be because of, say, a preferred style or a particular effect you are looking to achieve. Now, before we bring this video to a close, there is one more thing I'd like us to look at. Now, remember earlier I showed you this sentence, colorless green ideas sleep furiously, and I mentioned that it doesn't really matter if a sentence makes sense or not. What we're looking at is the structure, and if the structure is grammatical, then the sentence is grammatical. And yet, I showed you these other sentences, these three sentences, and I explained how understanding grammar can help you clarify meaning in them. So I was hoping you might have been wondering, where does meaning come in all of this? So is it important to grammar? Is it not important to grammar? Because that's something that most people wonder at times. But here's the thing: when you're thinking of meaning a language, it's mostly associated to semantics and pragmatics. So semantics is like it's studying general meaning in language, and then you have pragmatics, which looks at um, the meaning in specific context, expressed through what we call speech acts. And then when you're thinking of sound and language, like sound, basically, you're thinking of phonetics and phonology. And when you're thinking of structure, as we've just looked at, we're looking at structure, grammar, we are thinking of morphology and syntax. Now, these 6 units, they all work together to aid communication. And that's because they are the 6 core branches of linguistics. So there are times when you might see some overlap, as in the case of saying grammar interrelates with meaning. And there are even times when grammar, morphology might interact or have this relationship with phonetics. There's something called allomorphic variation, which is sort of like a relationship between morphemes and phonetics. I can't go into detail here, but it's the kind of rule that says when you have ed after a verb, like let's use kick and play for example. Now the k at the end of kick is a voiceless consonant, while the vowel sound ending the verb play is a voiced vowel. So now, allomorphic variation, one rule it states is that when you have ed following a voiced sound, that it should be pronounced d. That's why we say played. However, when you have ed following a voiceless sound, as in k, which is a voiceless consonant, you say kicked, not kicked. So this is one of those cases where you have this relationship between morphology and phonetics. So in a nutshell, even though grammar doesn't focus on meaning in the way that semantics and pragmatics do, it doesn't necessarily mean that meaning is completely useless in grammar, because it isn't. Meaning, we also factor meaning into grammar because grammar sometimes help clarify meaning. So to recap, what have you learned today? Well, you've learned the several popular misconceptions people have about what grammar is, and then you've also learned what grammar actually is. And then we talked about the prescriptive approach to grammar as well as the descriptive approach. I remember the distinction I made that descriptive grammar isn't correct grammar. That's not what it means. It's just stating that, okay, this is the grammar people actually use, while prescriptivism recommends a grammar guide in how people should use a particular language. And then we looked at what makes up grammar based on the definition we dissected. We figured out, or we discovered that grammar is made up of the sum of morphology and syntax. And then we looked at what makes a sentence ungrammatical. I remember I said it's more about structure than anything else. And then, speaking of structure, we looked at the basics of the sentence structural formula in traditional grammar, systemic functional grammar, and transformational generative grammar. And then we also looked at the MHQ structure, that's for phrases, which is modifier, head word, and the qualifier, to help us ascertain whether a particular phrase is a grammatical phrase. And then we've just looked at why grammar is important and why you should care about it. And finally, we looked at how grammar fits among other core branches of linguistics. And that is it for this video. If you've stuck around until this point, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it. But before I let you go, I have just one quick challenge for you. It's an easy one, I promise, but I'll admit it's also quite tricky. So, what I want you to do is to take a look at these two sentences and just determine which one of them is grammatical. Is it the team is winning or the team are winning? And try not to use AI or Google. Try to just, give it some thought and share what you think before you go out to confirm whether or not you're right. So feel free to head down to the comments after this video ends and just, share what you think. And even if you check later and you realize that you are wrong, you don't have to delete the comments. There really is no shame in making mistakes. As a matter of fact, mistakes are all part of the learning process. And with that, we've come to the end of this video. So if you enjoyed watching it, or if you feel like you learned a thing or two, I would really appreciate your support. Just hit the thumbs up button, subscribe, and please turn on notifications so you get an update every time I drop a new video. And if you can think of a friend or two who would really appreciate the knowledge shared in this video, please use the share button and just, spread the word. So thank you so much for sticking by. I'll see you in my next video. In the meantime, enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.